Let's talk about non-disclosure agreements, well, we're still allowed to. What is a non-disclosure agreement? Because you see these crop up a lot in news stories. Well, as the name suggests, this is where you agree with somebody not to disclose something. And these crop up quite a lot generally, and you may actually be subject to a non-disclosure agreement and not actually have noticed it. For instance, lots of employment contracts actually have non-disclosure agreements in there, because this is how this all started. It all started to protect, quotes, trade secrets. Like, what are the 11 secret herbs and spices in KFC? Well, I'm guessing at least 2 of them are salt and pepper. But the idea is that, you might have some secret manufacturing process, and it's okay, you can protect it with a patent and things like that, but that's not to stop one of your employees coming in and sort of like making notes of everything and then rushing off and working for a rival company or setting their own company up. Similar things just like customer databases, customer lists, your client lists. And that's why quite often, as well as an employment contract will contain confidentiality clauses about things like that, it might also have sort of anti-competition clauses and what's called restraint of trade, where once you've left you can't use any of that material, or indeed you can't work in that business for 12 months or something like that. I mean, that's a subject in itself, because there is a big debate as to how enforceable restraint of trade clauses are. I mean, that even overruled all the how football worked with the transfers and things, because they said, well, look, we're just workers and we can go work for whoever we want, and it's not for the football associations to say we can't. So that's why it all got a bit complicated. I've got some friends who are sports lawyers. I'll have to drag them on because it's quite a fascinating subject in itself. But anyway, back to the topic at hand. So you could have a contractual non-disclosure agreement, like I say, and this is something, now just put a bit of controversy in there because this is quite a dry subject. For instance, you get this a lot in sort of the medical profession and teaching, because obviously you don't want the receptionist at your local GP sat, down the bingo later that evening going, oh, I had Mr. So-and-so in, oh, his hemorrhoids are terrible, or anything like that. But similarly with teachers, you don't want teachers sitting around the pub passing around the ready rub. So who gets that reference, showing my age there, just talking about, oh, God, little Johnny, he's a right tearaway and he did this and this, or somebody wet themselves. So teachers aren't allowed to discuss anything about their pupils. And to get the controversy in that sort of Tommy Robinson thing, where he said, oh, the teachers are subject to NDAs and why were they silenced? There's nothing unusual about it. All teachers are prohibited from discussing things about their pupils outside of school and in the general public, because that protects the pupil's right to privacy. So there's nothing particularly controversial there. However, that would not have stopped him getting witness summoning these teachers to court, because one of the things that allows you to go behind a non-disclosure agreement is things like they don't apply in court proceedings. So it doesn't matter, you can't sort of say, oh well, that person can't give evidence because there's a non-disclosure agreement. Court proceedings overrule that. Similarly, so do parliamentary inquiries. Also, people can breach non-disclosure agreements in Parliament. You can let your MP know. Because there's all the whistleblowing stuff, protection of Public Interest Disclosure Act and things like that, which I've done a separate video on. You can go Google it or look it up on the channel. But that's where you have certain protections that if you are disclosing wrongdoing or anything like that. And that's another reason for breaching an NDA. There is no confidence in iniquity, as we say. So you can't theoretically use NDAs to cover up wrongdoing. But of course, a lot of the time people say, well, we're not covering wrongdoing. We deny all this and we say this isn't true, but we'll give you loads of money not to repeat these allegations we say are untrue. Now, the reason for doing that is, if you were to sue in defamation, we have what we call the doctrine of no prior restraint, publish and be damned. Generally speaking, you cannot get an injunction in defamation proceedings. If you say this person's putting lies out about me, it's well tough, we'll go to trial, and if it turns out they were lying about you, we'll compensate you with damages, and that will rehabilitate your reputation and give you vindication. However, it's different with privacy and confidentiality. You can get injunctions in confidentiality, and they're relatively easy to get at first instance, because it's very easy to say, look, if you don't grant this injunction, the cat's out of the bag and you can't put the cat back in the bag. So quite often you'll go for what we used to call an ex parte injunction, now a without notice injunction, where you'll go to court and say, somebody's about to publish something about me. It's confidential information. And they're not allowed to do that. And quite often the courts will say, okay, well, we'll give you your injunction now just to preserve the status quo, but the other side can come back within 72 hours and they can argue whether this injunction should actually stay in place. Or some people down there on quad bikes in a definitely no motor vehicle area. I'll pan around later on and show you, because it's a rather pretty spot, this and stuff. Oh, no, can't do that, Al. So yeah, so hang on, where were we? Non-disclosure, blah, blah. Oh yeah, court proceedings, stuff like that. One way of actually getting, what if you sort of have somebody where you say, they are breaching my privacy, but also everything they say is lies. Well, this actually cropped up, a case called Ash and McKennitt. They'd hired like a housekeeper nanny. And she tried to do a big expose about, oh, they were terrible to the children and all this sort of thing, and it's a dysfunctional household. And said, well, none of that's true, but in any respect, she can't say this because as part of her employment contract as housekeeper nanny, there's a clause in there saying you can't discuss anything, you know, that happens at the home, because that's the right to privacy. And in that case, the court upheld it because they said, even though you're saying a lot of this isn't true, you still have the protection because of the privacy. Also, you've got common law rights to privacy. You know, there are certain things where you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So let's say, for instance, somebody does a kiss and tell on you. Somebody has an illicit, you know, an affair with you or something like that, and then they want to go to the newspapers. Well, the secrets of the bedroom have always been deemed to be confidential unless there's a public interest in showing otherwise. So say, for instance, somebody was a moral crusader. Oh, I campaign against everything. I'm old school, family values. And it turns out they were having illicit affairs. In that situation, it may be acceptable to actually breach the privacy, because what you're doing there is you are showing up hypocrisy. And again, that's another reason that you can breach a non-disclosure agreement, is to correct a misimpression that the other person is putting out. So say, for instance, it's a work one or something like that. You are prohibited from discussing anything that happened when you worked for us. And then they come along and say, oh, our working proceedings were always fine, we never had any accidents there, we behaved ethically, all our funding was correct. You go, well, that's not true. Then that in itself can be a reason for breaching a non-disclosure agreement. Now, there's a lot of controversy about this because people are using them, to cover up wrongdoing, especially cases of SUL misconduct, to put it very, very mildly. Now, interestingly, because there's been talk about banning NDAs. If you work at a university, there's this sort of university brackets freedom of expression close brackets act or something like that, and that actually means that prohibits the use of NDAs against staff or students at educational universities. So that's been brought in because apparently there was lots of power imbalances and it was seen as a particular problem. But some people have argued that you shouldn't be able to do you shouldn't be able to use an NDA just to stop people talking about you getting up to those sorts of things. And a lot of organisations have used them. People who should know better. I mean, trades unions that are always on about, oh, we protect workers and workers' rights. They've quite often used NDAs against members of staff for the union who've complained about wrongdoing at the union, especially SUL wrongdoing. Even political parties, they've used NDAs sort of quite a lot. Can you be forced into an NDA? Well, part of the problem is if you this gets to like legal, litigation stage. Well, obviously we're all encouraged to settle, and most cases do settle. So it's not uncommon for people to say, I will give you a large sum of money, without any admission of liability and all that, to drop your claim. But I also want an NDA. Now we get to the very interesting subject there about, can you be forced to do that? Because as we've mentioned before, with like the way offers work, settlement offers, if somebody makes you an offer and says, I will give you this amount of money, and you say, no, I'm not taking it, and then you go to trial and you don't beat that offer, in other words, you don't get more than they offered you, then the courts will say, well, they offered you more than this back in the day, so you have to pay all their costs of the proceedings, because these proceedings were a nullity because you could have had all this like months or years ago. However, of course, where it's something saying, because a court generally cannot grant an injunction, except in sort of some situations like defamation. It's very common when defamation is proved, they will grant an injunction. But when it comes to sort of offers and things, generally speaking, all you can get is damages. So that's the worst that could happen to the other side. They would have to pay you some money. They wouldn't be able, arguably, especially if it's not a defamation thing, it's a confidence privacy thing about what was happening, sort of at work or in a family or in an organisation or something like that. They'll say, well, the court can't order that, so you saying we will only give you this money if you also agree to a non-disclosure, then that arguably you can refuse and say, I don't care that they offered me more money, they also wanted this other thing, this injunction or this non-disclosure agreement that I'm just not willing, usually you can actually give undertakings. So if somebody says, I want to get an injunction against you, and these are all the terms that are, all the things that I want you to not do, you can actually say, well, you don't need the injunction, I'll just give undertakings not to do that. So the advantage of that is, you don't have an injunction against you, because somebody can say, oh, he's injuncted, he's got a non-molestation or anything like that. But it has the same effect, and if you breach the undertakings, then people can, sue you on the back of the breach of the undertakings. But where it comes to somebody saying, I will only settle this case if you give an NDA, you are reasonably safe in saying, well, no, I'm not doing that because I need the vindication. I want to be able to talk about that. Well, put it this way, I hope that is the current law, because otherwise I'm going to get a right kicking from a judge in June, because that's an argument I've got coming up, actually. But there you go. So, like I say, it's when it comes to privacy, I mean, basically, the situations it can arise, there might be a common law duty of privacy if it's something that people have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So you can't, generally speak, talk about relationships and private things unless it's already out in the public domain. There can be pre-existing contractual obligations on you, like your employment contract might say you can't speak about this, or it's something that parties can agree to as a sort of settlement, and they can agree between themselves. But yeah, they are very controversial because they are quite often just used to threaten people to shut them up. I mean, there's a sort of a carrot and stick approach there, really, isn't there? It can be like, well, if you don't shut up, I'll sue you, and there's all the hassle of litigation and the cost risk and all that sort of thing. But also the big carrot thing, which is like, look, you have got a case, and you can't be forced to do this, but what if I give you a massive sum of money to do it? And like I said, then you get into the situations as to, well, what in the future people break this? And I think this will crop up with a few cases that I'm not going to comment about, where there's allegations of, criminal behaviour, but in the past they've been dealt with, they've dealt with the complainants by saying, well, we'll give you some money to go, in compensation of what you say we did, but we deny we did, but we'll give you the money anyway, but we want an NDA on the back of it. But does that stop you going to the police and complaining about it? Not necessarily. Because of the iniquity thing, and also it certainly doesn't stop you if the police ask you and say, well, your name's come up, you can definitely talk to the police and you can definitely give evidence, and that is not a breach of the non-disclosure agreement. So there you go. As always, hope you found that vaguely interesting, vaguely useful, vaguely accurate. Where am I today? Well, over my shoulder, that's a place called Wheel Virgin, which is quite a nice little mine. Actually, it's actually a copper mine. The people who bought it, they thought they'd bought. It's another one around here where people were buying sort of worn-out mines for like peanuts, and then it turned out that actually they weren't worn out, and there was actually the largest lode of copper in Cornwall, which probably means in the UK, probably means in the world actually, maybe not in South America, around here. So, but what I'll do is I'll spin round and show you the valley down there. The valley, that's wheel made mine down there, and as I pan round you'll see what we call the tailings dams, because obviously tin mines produce a lot of water. So what do you do with all that water? Well, you basically put it in big ponds and you filter it out because it's so full of heavy metals. I mean, the water gets dirtier because even to this day it's still leaching all the stuff from the mines. So there's that one there that is actually sort of vaguely safe to swim in. I hope so anyway, because I've been in there. I mean, the dogs go in, so I'm sure it's fine. There's another one that's perhaps a little less savoury, and then the one that you can't see because it's over the other dam, that just looks like Lucasade. So I certainly don't go in there. And just to give you a bit more history, underneath here, actually I'll pan around so you get a nice picture of that, hooligans. Underneath here there's something called the Great Adit, which is a massive 40 miles of tunnels, which is basically just to pump the water out of the mines. And it's one of the few things that all the mine owners actually agreed on, because it was it's in everybody's interest. If your neighbour's mine floods, well, it's not good for your mine anyway. But at the height of its operation, back in day, there were more steam engines just servicing the Great Adit than there was in the rest of Europe and the Americas put together. Yes, there's gold in them there hills. Actually, there is gold as well. Actually, there's quite a lot of gold in Cornwall. There's quite a lot of uranium as well. I think I've done before about the uranium mining in Cornwall with all my uranium glass stuff that I got from the charity shop. So if there's a demand for that, I'll do another one.